Welcome, everyone. I woke everyone up. We have an exciting panel for you on facial recognition systems and a great lineup. And in that corner, to start off with, we have Megan Goulding from Liberty, from the United Kingdom. Next to Megan, we have Sandra Leaton from the Biometrics Institute, also United Kingdom. Next to Sandra is Stanley from ACLU. He's come from the US. On my other side, there's Karolina Mojzesowicz from DG Justice. And to my right is Pedro Torres from Vision Box from Portugal. And then finally, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for this session, Ben Hayes from the Transnational Institute and also the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I'll hand over to Ben now.
Okay, thanks, Rosamunde. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. What we're going to do with this panel, I'm just going to invite each of the speakers just to give a kind of 5-minute introduction to sort of how they came to be working on facial recognition and sort of how they see the issues in terms of the work they're doing. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask Megan Goulding from Liberty, a human rights organization based in the UK, to get us underway. And if you could do about 5 minutes each. Great, thanks.
Hi, everyone. I think my role on this panel is maybe to be the most radical, along with Jay, perhaps. But let me reassure some of you straight off that it's not necessarily the tech that I may be opposing this afternoon, but the way that the police are using it in the UK. So I work for Liberty, who are a human rights organisation in the UK. I'm one of their lawyers, and I run the privacy and tech litigation there. And one of the cases that I'm running at the moment, and I suppose the reason I'm here, is it's a challenge to the police's use of facial recognition in the UK. For those of you who aren't familiar with how the police are using this technology in the UK, there are 2 police forces currently using it in live settings, the first being in London and the second being in Wales. For those of you who don't know where that is, that's hidden on the left-hand side. I am Welsh, so please don't take offence at that. Despite being Welsh, it is the Welsh police force that I am taking to court. And the reason we're taking them to court is they're really leading the way in the deployment of facial recognition. They've got all the funding from the UK Home Office. They've used it the most amount of times in live settings. And where do they use it? They use it, well, first of all, it was at big events. So it started with the Champions League final in 2017. And then it continued with music concerts, sports matches, that kind of thing. But more worryingly, perhaps, it's starting to be rolled out as just part of everyday policing. So you see the vans with the cameras on top, parked up on Cardiff High Street relatively regularly. And another worrying aspect, particularly worrying aspect for us, is that it's been used in the protest context, so against protesters. And I can talk a little bit more about that maybe later. So very briefly, just to say, why is it that Liberty oppose the use of facial recognition by the police in live settings? It's really principally a human rights argument. It won't surprise you that I'm saying that, given I'm from a human rights organisation. We believe that the use of this technology in live settings is an unjustifiable violation of people's rights to privacy, their rights to free expression and free assembly, and also their right to be free from discrimination. And we can talk more about that, but many of us here will know that this technology discriminates against women and black and ethnic minority groups. And then there are also concerns, of course, around data protection. I'm sure we'll cover all of those, but that's all I'll say for now.
Thanks, Meg. So, yeah, moving swiftly on, we've got Sandra from the Biometrics Institute, so perhaps you could say a bit about how you're coming to approach this issue. Thank you.
So I've got two hats. So I'm representing the Biometric Institute today. I'm also a university professor from University College London, where I work in the Institute of Education. And for children and young people, this has got so many possible consequences and implications that it's of increasing concern to academics and policymakers and so on. I mean, we're talking about an enormous growth in the industry. By 2023, it's being said that it will be valued at 9.6 billion US dollars. And one enormous market is schools, universities, educational institutions, and so on. And these are places that young people don't often have any choice about whether they attend. It's not a realistic choice. And so increasingly, attending an educational institution means compromising on your privacy. And we're in the process of trying to decide at what point that's too much, weighted too heavily in favour of business and industry trying to monetize people's privacy. So it's been a really interesting 12 months. We've had what some people are calling the year of the tech backlash. And certainly we've seen increasing regulations for things like sort of privacy and biometrics in general. But we see facial recognition as a completely separate category in some ways, because it's one of the very few biometrics that you can capture remotely without anybody knowing that you're doing it. So whereas if you're going to capture a fingerprint or DNA or something, all those are quite tightly regulated and you need to have the person there. But this is the first time that you could capture an image off the internet, or you could take a picture of somebody in a public place, and somehow that's okay. And then you can turn that into some kind of controlling surveillance device. So it's something the Biometrics Institute are quite concerned about. And we're working very hard with a range of organisations to make sure that the digital privacy rights of children and young people are properly accommodated. For example, we work with the UK Children's Commissioner, thinking about how children's data, particularly in an era of sort of Internet of Things and driverless cars and that kind of thing, exactly what is being collected and how is that data being used. We see use and abuse of facial recognition software in packages like Class Dojo, where children are monitored endlessly in their everyday lives at school and given a metric according to how compliant they're being, which is then circulated and recorded and possibly sent home, which is something that many people find very disturbing. So I'm often quite publicly critical about functions such as that. There are benign uses for facial recognition software. So, for example, we have the growth of what we call virtual proctor functions, which is when somebody needs to sit a distance learning exam in real time on a computer, but to save them having to drive hundreds, if not thousands of miles to an exam centre around the world, to give them the option of doing it online. But of course, there needs to be a system that verifies identity so that we know that the person who's supposed to be doing the exam is doing it and that it's been the same person throughout the exam. So there's some scope there. And there's also been some useful scope for things like verification of school funding as anti-fraud measures in parts of the developing world. So again, you've got real people with real identification, receiving real money, and we haven't got fake or ghost pupils, fake or ghost schools to bump up government funding that then isn't going into the education system. So it's getting a balance between those benign and less benign applications that occupies our time. Of course, we had the Illinois judgment last Friday. So the idea that to prove you don't have to prove distress any longer if a company has collected a facial biometric or a similar biometric from you. So, for example, the example that's used is a sort of leisure context. So, if a picture is taken at a theme park or a swimming pool or something like that, so you can gain access to something. If that breaches the law, goes the Illinois judgment, then that means that no distress claim is needed. Harm has been done. So this could revolutionise the way this is regulated in the light of that. We have to see. a couple of further points. So there's great potential for discrimination with facial recognition. In other presentations at this conference, we've heard a lot about the difficulty that artificial intelligence and machine learning systems have in working out the junk in, junk out argument. So you sort of teach that certain categories of people are likely to fit certain stereotypes, and that's just continually reinforced as the machine has more and more data. And that's a really difficult, if not intractable, problem for many smaller companies, I think, and some of the bigger ones. So, we're very concerned about this stereotyping of people and this undermining, really. I mean, humans are fantastic, aren't they? I mean, we're just so good. I'm looking at faces here. Some people even look interested. I can tell. I don't need an algorithm. We've got this really, really acute skill to be able to assess the probability of what somebody's thinking or feeling. We're really good at it. If we weren't good at it, we wouldn't be here. And so if we just hand this over to machines, we're not recognizing our true brilliance, actually, as a species. So I'm always anxious that we should hang on to the humanity in this. Final point that I wanted to make, the Biometrics Institute have biannually revised privacy guidelines, and they're very, very keen to always discuss these and have stakeholder conversations about this. And the idea of responsible use, which is something that Biometrics Institute's been talking about since 2005, and now feels they should have trademarked as a term. Now it's come of age. Now this is the conversation that we're all having. So hopefully, given this proliferation of facial recognition systems, combined with the really hard work that people are doing on the regulation and policy front, we might be able to end up with something that we actually like using.
Thank you, Sandy. So I'm going to hand over now to Karolina to tell us how the European Commission is approaching this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Indeed, so I worked at the European Commission, and what do we do and how do we see all these issues? For us, it's facial recognition technologies and are part of artificial intelligence. And here, what are the Commission actions? We have spelled it out in the communication on maximizing the benefits of artificial intelligence in April 2018. We have published, because of course all the aspects concerning ethics, which were mentioned by the panelists before, are very important. It's the reason we established a high-level expert group which produced ethic guidelines in December last year, which are currently under a consultation process, and you are very much welcomed to submit your comments by tomorrow. The deadline was already extended, yeah? But still, nevertheless, 24 hours more probably. Indeed, we do recognize it very much that facial recognition causes a lot of its challenges. We, however, do think that the legislative framework we have so far, namely the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, equips us very well with the means of framing the use of facial recognition and already the way it's designed. Why? The GDPR provides for very important tools on driving to auditability of the use of facial recognition techniques and putting on whoever uses it, the data controllers, the burden of accountability, the responsibility for use it, always in respect of the principles of fairness, purpose limitation, data minimization, and of course retention periods. So the elements GDPR, a part of the principles which I just mentioned, provides for is transparency and actually a prohibition of decisions made by automated means, so the use of automated decision-making, which prohibition is levied only in 3 circumstances: two of which are relevant in this in here for this gremium, namely explicit consent and the law. Now, in addition, facial recognition falls into the list of prohibitions again under Article 9 of the GDPR. So here we are speaking about processing of sensitive data, biometric data, which is processed for the purpose of uniquely identifying a natural person is a sensitive data, where again, this data can be processed only when one of the exceptions from Article 9.2 is providing for it. And again, explicit consent is one of the solutions. Now, I understand that there was some misunderstanding concerning some of the research projects run by the Commission, and here I think about the Horizon or projects made, research projects made within the Horizon project or bunch of projects. And here I would like to mention in particular the one on the facial recognition uses on the borders. I would like to underline, because I think there was some misunderstanding, in particular in British press. This is a research project. It's not even a pilot. It means the project is run on the basis of voluntary participation of individuals who were informed, who were already admitted, because this project, whoever does not know it, is supposed to, is researching the effectiveness of possibility of use of facial recognition while on the EU borders, so that our checks on the borders can be more effective and efficient. Well, again, this research project is based on the voluntary participations of individuals who were already admitted. So it's a real true consent. Yeah, they do not depend. Their admission onto the European territory does not depend on the consent being given to the participation in the research project. So it's just a verification of the possibilities for a purely research research aims. Sorry. Well, I think I would not run, all this whole story about what the Commission does on artificial intelligence. We had a panel devoted to it yesterday, and of course, a big parts of it, I just mentioned the high-level expert group and the communication we had, applies also in this area. So I think I will hand over to the other speakers.
Thank you, Karolina. So now I'd like to pass over to Jay Stanley, and a very old friend of CPDP, an old friend, not an old person. And he's going to tell us a bit, hopefully, about how things are looking from the other side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, I'd say not great. I think that I would echo a lot of what my co-panelists have said about the moral and ethical implications here. And basically in the United States, to a degree, it's a wild west when it comes to the regulatory environment in contrast to much of Europe. We have a couple of state-level laws that cover biometrics, one in Illinois, which is quite strong and just was upheld at the Supreme Court of Illinois. And then we have much weaker ones in Texas and Washington State. The Washington State one, for example, I believe as a result of the influence of lobbying by Facebook, specifically excludes face data from the definition of biometrics. And we have heard that Facebook and other companies are lobbying hard in other states that have proposed legislation to exclude facial data from the definition of biometrics. So, we're seeing government deployments. Customs and Border Patrol has a pilot program in airports to basically take photos of departing international passengers and to see that they match the photographs that the government already has on record. So basically a very complex face recognition system to do nothing but replace the human activity of looking at a passport photo and looking at your face and making sure they're the same thing. We have seen our TSA, our Transportation Security Agency, has put out a visioning document for sort of a grand scale, long-term, medium-term use of face recognition throughout the airport system. We've seen the Secret Services trialing use of face recognition on the public streets near and around the White House. And police departments across the United States are using face recognition. Unlike in many European countries, we have a big problem in the United States of police departments acquiring and deploying surveillance technologies without telling, let alone asking their communities and sometimes the city councils that pass their budgets. They get grants from the federal government, they get companies, give them donations, and now for a very, very small price, you can just pay Amazon, send photographs to Amazon's recognition service. We at the ACLU have done a lot of work on this, and for very small numerical amounts, you can do face recognition at a local level. The United States has about 16,000 to 18,000 police departments, and there is no central federal regulation of these police departments when it comes to this kind of use of technology, and so we see stuff all over the map. We see some very progressive police chiefs, and then we see a lot of departments that just start using the stuff. They don't tell anybody, they don't ask anybody, they don't go through any kind of process, they don't have privacy policies. We've seen this with license plate recognition and many other technologies, and now we're starting to see it with face recognition thanks to Amazon's service, which makes it so easy. All the states have basically photographs of every citizen through the driver's licenses or IDs. If you don't have a driver's license, you get a state identity card. And the more than half of the states have given the FBI permission to run searches of unknown suspects against those DMV databases. It's an enormously powerful thing. It's completely unregulated. There's no quality control. We don't know if these are accurate. We don't know what the false positives and false negatives rates are. And so, of course, here is the transparency problem. We are seeing it in schools. We have this problem in the United States of school shootings. And this is being used to sell face recognition as a school security device. We are seeing face recognition in stores. We sent letters to the top 20 American retailers asking them if they were using face recognition on their customers. Only 2 of the 20 would even respond to us. One, a hardware chain, Lowe's, said that they were, and one, a grocery conglomerate, Aldi, which is actually German, probably not coincidentally, said that they were not. Nobody else would even answer us. But we know that there's a lot of experimentation with marketing and so forth in terms of face recognition. We know that it's being used in concerts and sports venues. There was stories when it came out that it was being used at a Taylor Swift concert to try and identify stalkers of Taylor Swift, which is unfortunately a very real problem if you're a Taylor Swift or other celebrities. But it was used basically without anybody being notified. We don't know what the retention policies were, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, and just to close with 2 quick points. Face recognition for security purposes is of no use unless there is a watch list to back it up. You need to have the people that you're looking for. You have to have a list of those people. And within the watch list area is an enormously fraught set of problems. We have a government set of watch lists in the United States, which has been, even after years of reform efforts, continues to be beset with Kafkaesque problems. People who are put on there who should not be on there. Too many people are on there. People cannot get off. They don't know why they were put on there. They can't get themselves off, et cetera, et cetera. We also have a growing sector of private sector watch lists. There are private companies that are now starting to develop face recognition watch lists and trying to sell them to government agencies and potentially others of supposed terrorists and criminals. And again, you have all the problems with the government watch lists, and you have additional problems, which are these are private companies, and they're not subject to even the very limited controls that we have in the United States against government agencies, such as the Privacy Act, Freedom of Information Act, and the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment. So that is a big problem. And a lot of this is, for example, in the airport context, is based on a notion of identity-based security. That if we know who you are and we know things about you, we can rank you as a security threat and do security on that basis. And it is both from it's a civil liberties terrible path to go down because it puts the government into it sets up an infrastructure for the government to collect more and more information about people and puts them in the business of ranking their own citizens based on unclear criteria. And it also is bad from a security point of view because we don't know, for example, in the airport context, who is likely to attack aviation. It's such a rare event that each attack is basically sui generis, one of a kind. And if you have a criminal record, are you more likely to attack an airplane, or are you a selfish person who's less likely to, attack an airplane for a cause or what have you? Nobody really has any idea. There's no feedback mechanisms, and face recognition is an inherent part of this grasp on identity-based security, which we see American security agencies going down. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. So last but by no means least, Pedro, I think he's got a presentation. If we could get his slides up on the screen. There we go. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So this is a very interesting topic. I'll explain my angle and how I fit into this panel as well. So I work in a technology company, and we do facial recognition systems, and we deploy them in a set of settings. One of the settings is border control, which has been mentioned here, which is a very specific setting in which someone needs to go through access, to get access to some, there's a barrier there called the frontier, the border, where you can be allowed to go or not. And to know if you're allowed to go or not and pass to that country, there's a whole set of processes established by law. One of them is to, know who you are, and knowing who you are poses a lot of questions. From our perspective is we need to have someone who has a passport, whether that passport is a good means of knowing if that person poses a threat or not is an issue outside my work, but there's an identity, an official identity from a country issued to some person. To that person, there's biometrics associated. There's a photograph, in some cases there's fingerprints. What we do is to check that the person that sits in front of one of these, gates there, which is a border control e-gate. What we check is to do the border control automatically. We check that the person in front of this gate is indeed matching the biometrics that's in some passport, and we give that information. And then the police has watch lists and other means of identifying whether they should be allowed to go into the country or not. That's one part of what we do. But the reason I'm here as well is, besides border, which is a very, let's say, regulated and very well-defined setting, as Jay was mentioning, there's this kind of trend now on how can we leverage on this to improve both facilitation and security on an airport or in other contexts. So some of the things I heard here are different from the angle we came from. We always come from the angle of consent. So if the picture I have there is of a system that can operate on an airport, whereby a user, a passenger, says, I want to go faster in the airport, so I register myself with my biometrics as part of the process, and I can use it to go through a lot of steps much quicker. This poses a lot of privacy and ethical issues that we've discussed here. And what we've tried to do, and that's, I think, an angle I try to bring here, is we want to make, so the consent and the privacy for us are the two key elements here for this to make any sense. So the angle we've adopted is the passenger, there can be no tracking of a person's face and knowing who they are and doing anything with it unless that person knows that's going to happen and knows what the purpose is to do that. So our idea is, just imagine, you have a passport, which is a physical thing, but imagine that thing sits in your smartphone, and it's a smart passport, which you can do things with. So when you go to an airport, you can say, yes, I'm going to Gatwick Airport, and I've created an identity for which the biometrics sits in my phone and I control. There's no database of biometrics anywhere else. It's my phone, like your passport has biometrics in it. And I can process this, give this information to be processed to access a particular point. If that happens, everything is discarded except that the door opens. So once this door is open because you've matched and you have some token, so for example, you want to go through security. For security, you need to have some flight that you've bought a ticket for. For that, you need usually this QR code that you show to the machine. In this idea, you don't show anything, you just show up there. And because you've given authorization, the machine, as it recognizes you, knows this person is Pedro, and I know that he's in this list, and he has, which is the list that already exists, which is the passenger list, and this guy has a flight, and we can give them access. And you can go in this fashion on all these points by voluntarily saying, I want to be recognized here, and the purpose is, security. So I'm showing my boarding pass and my ticket at this point. I'm showing my passport at this other point, or I'm showing at the boarding, you need to show your passport again and your boarding pass. So at each step, you're being recognized. The biometrics is not on the cloud anywhere. No one can do that without you knowing. You are giving the consent on the phone and saying, please identify myself, and now I get the access I need. So this is how technologically we are putting a way of making the passenger in control of privacy and consent, but at the same time solving the other two. This is the privacy angle, but there's all the other two pillars of this, which are security and facilitation. On the one hand, people move faster, and it's a problem we're trying to solve in the world. Lots of the number of passengers is going like Bitcoin graphics without the bad parts of Bitcoin. And that means there's a lot of stress on how can we efficiently use resources to build airports and to make them efficient. On the other hand, there's also security. So we need to be aware that people need to be identified as they go through the border, for example. They don't need to be identified in some other context in the airport, but there's some specific control points where identity plays a role, and there's people who are not allowed to go and people who are allowed to go. If you have no means of checking who that person is, you cannot make this choice. At the moment, there are some ways of doing it. We believe that this technological framework can improve, the efficiency, but also the privacy. Because at the moment, privacy is also not very well, even without biometrics, it's not very well catered for. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Pedro, and thanks everybody for keeping your remarks brief. So I've got a few questions that I'd like to ask the panelists myself, and then we'll of course open it up to you guys. I guess, one of the things that I'm most interested in, I was on a panel yesterday with an artist called Adam Harvey, who's been he's got this art project just mapping the use of facial recognition and the training databases that are out there to train the algorithms. But he did a walkthrough of 40. Well, he's identified 44 different areas in which computer scientists and researchers believe that using computer analysis, there's a lot more information that can be discerned from a facial image. So we often think about facial recognition just in terms of the matching. As Pedro said, is the person walking through the border gate the person in the passport? The same for these kind of surveillance systems. We're just trying to pick out faces in the crowd. But when you start seeing, where a lot of this research and development is going, you've got people making claims that facial images and algorithms trained to analyze them can ascertain everything from ethnicity to sexuality, attractiveness, trustworthiness, health, emotional state. And I guess I'd like to ask each of the panelists where they see the direction of travel with this technology or with the specific things that they're looking at, and what concerns they may have. So specifically to Meg, you talked about this, being used for protests, moving towards routine deployments. You talked about there being, clear fundamental rights violations. Maybe you can go into a bit more detail about what those are. For Sandy, you talked a lot about trying to make sure that biometrics tech developers are focused solely on the responsible use of biometrics, but what sort of, how does that help us, filter out perhaps the less responsible, the irresponsible use of biometrics? For Karolina, again, you talked about, the Commission's AI policy being about maximizing the benefits. Not only, but, I guess for those of us who are concerned about the direction of travel, we'd also be interested to hear a little more about what might be done to minimize the harms. And just to sort of flesh out the inspiration for this panel, what was actually the project that you mentioned. So I'll just say, for those who aren't aware of this specific EU-funded research project, it's called Border Control, and it's basically using this sort of computer visual analysis of faces. It's like a smart lie detection system to tighten Europe's borders using lie detecting avatars, advanced analytics, and risk-based border management. And it was indeed criticized in The Guardian. They said, it's pseudoscience. And we did invite, we invited the people behind this research project to come and talk a bit about it. They didn't want to come. We asked DG Research if they might want to come and sort of. But I guess my question is, the Commission doesn't seem to have much of a filter in the sense of, what gets funded. I mean, yes, you've got the GDPR, and yes, you've got sort of some reasonably robust ethics guidelines on paper, but does there need to be a bit more control and reflection on the kind of stuff that's getting, the kind of funding decisions that are being taken at the R&D stage? And then just sort of finally for Pedro, with the happy flow of people through borders, I was reminded of those buttons you now press to rate your experience. But I guess my worry as someone who comes at this from a civil liberties angle would be once you build this kind of infrastructure with cameras everywhere, the potential to just load some of these new applications onto this kind of infrastructure that is being built at the border becomes potentially quite frightening. So I don't know if this is something you've thought of or, but it's often the case, I think, that the border emerges as a bit of a testing ground for technologies of social control with quite alarming implications. And, maybe this is something you've thought about. So we'll just go along the line, perhaps.
Okay. Again, it won't surprise you to hear me say that Liberty is really concerned not just about how it's being used at the moment, but how it may be used in the future. But first of all, the worrying aspects of how it's being used now, let's just touch upon a couple of those. So the protest context I mentioned already, and just to explain what this was in a bit more detail, there was an anti-arms fair protest happening in Cardiff in Wales, and facial recognition hadn't long been introduced by the Welsh police, and they took their vans down there and parked them up opposite the protesters with their cameras pointing directly at them. At no point did they, or we've spoken to a number of protesters, and what they say to us is, at no point did the police give out any information about the technology or how it was being used. And the protesters have said to us quite understandably that if they knew this technology was being used at a future protest, then they would think again about turning up. Because to them, giving up their sensitive biometric data to the police when they don't know how that will then be used is not worth it in their eyes. And these are people who are used to protesting vigorously and frequently. And it's not hard to imagine why they think like that. In the UK, we have a track record of the police creating very shady databases on who they term domestic extremists. And these are usually just troublesome protesters. Often they don't have even criminal records. They just turn up to protests, and the police like to track them. And you can imagine that facial recognition might be used, particularly in an environment in the UK without law or regulation, to expand that same purpose. One other point about how it's being currently used is in the UK, it hasn't just been used for criminal purposes. There was a deployment by the Met Police in London where they used it to try and find people who were mentally unwell. Just let that sit for a second. There was an event happening on Remembrance Sunday, and they were worried about people they termed disturbed people approaching the area where the public were and somehow disrupting the event. And so they had a watch list of people they believed to be disturbed, in their words, and they did stop someone and they prevented them from entering the public arena where they should have been allowed to go and escorted them away. And they did that without consulting at all medical professionals. Just imagine for a second that you are someone who is mentally unwell, being approached by someone and told that you're being watched, that you're on a watch list, that you've been identified and you're going to be asked to leave would be a pretty terrifying experience indeed. And just finally, how this might be used going forward. This isn't just theoretical, but statements have been made by the police about how they're really excited to use this technology in normal CCTV cameras and in body-worn video, which itself is being rolled out really quickly in police forces. And that touches on the issue that a lot of my fellow panelists have already touched on about consent. At the moment, the police can ostensibly say that there is consent. I would, of course, disagree with that. They provide little to no information. Their deployments are happening. But they at least say that they're trying to only involve people who are consenting to walking past the cameras. If your CCTV system or your police force have body-worn video with this technology, how are you supposed to consent or not consent? By stepping outside your front door, you have to give over your sensitive biometric data. And I'll just remind you, there aren't regulations, rules in place in the UK to control what then happens to that data.
So I was just to pick up on what you were saying about the idea of people being easily profiled as having mental problems. I can just imagine a really dystopian scenario where you could barely leave the house if you had cerebral palsy or multiple sclerosis or something without being biometrically profiled as a troublemaker. So that's really disturbing. I've got in my office as one of my ornaments quite a cool thing that somebody got me as a present, which is a Victorian phrenology head. And I don't know if you know what phrenology is, but they used to have expert practitioners that would feel the lumps and bumps in your head. And these were mapped against areas. And by doing that, you were supposed to be able to profile what sort of person somebody was and whether they were a criminal or not. And the more I hear about profiling, certainly with regard to facial recognition, the more it sounds like phrenology to me, because the claims are just so enormous and overstated. So I blogged last week about coming to this conference, and Professor Sonia Livingston communicated back through the medium of Twitter, because I'd chosen a picture of, a sort of biometric-y sort of thing with lots of dots and lines on, of a woman smiling. And Sonia said, well, of course, you're always happy when you're smiling, aren't you? And therein lies the problem, the idea that we can tell any of this from such a simplistic image. So the claims are just so overstated that, I don't even know why we're taking them seriously. We're so far off being able to do this effectively. Moving on to this situation in schools. So the thing that I think disturbs most people is the idea of self-regulation just clearly isn't working. One of the, I'm routinely shocked, doing this line of research, and my outrage this week was really aimed at a firm who wanted to provide free body cams for teachers in class, so that, there are all sorts of rationales that it came up with, that this might be a good idea to do with teacher professional development or pupil control and so on. I mean, the idea of just being filmed by your teacher with the body cam, it's just so policey, isn't it? And that is not why we go to school. School should be an extension of home, not the police state. So, this kind of new phenomenon where we, instead of having a sort of one-to-one dyadic interaction between child and teacher and maybe a few onlookers, becomes one-to-many, because that can be recorded, it can be shared, it can pop up later in life, it can be used for things that we weren't expecting it to be used for. There's enormous numbers of unintended consequences. And I just don't think saying, well, the teacher might be able to have a bit more critical feedback from fellow professionals, I don't think that's a justification, because they can stand at the back of the class and watch. You don't need to be having all these high-tech tools. So heartily discourage that sort of use in an educational context. Which kind of gets us onto the whole classroom surveillance thing in general. So we have our children being nudged and poked and prodded and told to improve, and they're just projects, aren't they? You know, they're never quite good enough and so on. Now, it was ever thus. You know, I was told off a lot at school for not being perfect, and perhaps everybody else was, you know, sort of life as a project of the self kind of thing, working out who you are and what you're meant to be doing and trying to be a decent grown-up. But we're going way beyond that. And so instead of being able to be a little bit naughty at the right time or a little bit of a school activist or so on, you know, you have this sort of chilling effect of this constant surveillance that I think is quite disturbing. I speak as somebody who was quite naughty at school, but in a good way, in a good way. And I think people should be allowed to stand up for themselves and subvert a little bit. And so it's part of learning the boundaries, isn't it? And it's part of learning about how you might sort of relate to an adult world. So, you know, I would like to see a lot of this surveillance culture removed and replaced with more dialogue, actually. Which brings us on to the idea of, so how do we map this, and how do we look at this, and how do we analyse this, and what critique can we bring to bear, and so on. And I just wanted to highlight the absolute frustration that many of us researching in the field feel, because there's a distinct lack of interdisciplinary academic funding for this. So, you know, a lot of people are writing really excellent proposals, but they tend to be kind of hybrid engineering, ethics, education, society type proposals. And increasingly, I think people are feeling that funding bodies just can't seem to take on board this rather messy hybrid nature of the work that's going on. And so the reviews that come back are really almost irrelevant, because they just haven't taken on board this congruence of the different disciplines. So I think if there was one plea I could make today, it was that you know, everybody gives a bit of thought to the sort of funding path for some of this work that can really point the way for really robust policy and regulation, so that it's kind of helpful and supportive. Rather than having, you know, some very good work happening at the sidelines. It should be much more central to development.
Yeah, sorry, Joe, I realised I didn't direct a question at you.
Okay.
I know you're conducting some research on the sort of the direction of travel for this, so maybe you could...
Yeah, just 2 quick points to add to what's been said. There is an enormous amount of work being done in the computer science AI field on machine vision. Some of it's being done for self-driving cars and other things, but as a side effect, it is allowing the analysis of video feeds in many ways beyond face recognition. We're doing a report on this for the ACLU forthcoming, but you know, in addition to emotion recognition and so forth, their analysis of body language. Are you nervous because of the way your body moves? And even putting aside identification, even if they don't know who you are because the face recognition isn't working because you're wearing a hat or what have you, you can be judged based on everything from your posture to your face, et cetera. And again, the chilling effects, feeling like you're being watched all the time. Most of the surveillance cameras that monitor us, we don't worry about, because we sort of implicitly know that the video will be stored and nothing will be done with it unless something dramatic happens, most likely. But as AI is connected to these cameras, then we will, in a meaningful way, be monitored. And there is an enormous amount of utter baloney when it comes to this kind of analysis of you know, emotions and you know, how people are feeling, and it goes all the way back to the polygraphs in 1910 and this idea that external things can reflect your internal state. And I guess I would just say that we are afraid both of these technologies, when they don't work, when they're fake, and when they do work. Those are separate issues, but both are of concerns in different ways. And lastly, the problem in the United States context, at least, is that our criminal justice system and other government agencies have proven themselves to be very terrible at sorting out good science from bad. And so we have had tragic cases of people who have been convicted of crimes based on police forensic work that the judicial system, the criminal justice system, is not able to detect is in fact baloney. And we worry that as these AI techniques come down and make various claims to many, you know, of those 16,000 police departments and other officials who are not necessarily always very sophisticated in detecting what is snake oil and what isn't, that there will be big harms, not only from true privacy invasions from accurate technology, but also from pseudoscience.
Thanks, Jay. Pedro.
So there's, I think, 3 points from this discussion. I think the first one is, and that the comment of we are worried when it works and when it doesn't work. That's spot on. I mean, machine learning is bound to fail in a sense because it's only probabilistic. We call it artificial intelligence, but there's no intelligence. The intelligent part is of the person who created these algorithms. Maybe the algorithm was created with some background information, and we've created the algorithm, and it evolved to something that most of the times says a correct answer. Or most of the times it doesn't. It depends on the areas. So, for example, face recognition is one of them where we have quite good systems at the moment that can detect if this person is the same or not. But they're bound to fail as well. There's only a probability that they are doing the right thing. And that is one which is very objective. You're looking at the face, you know who the people are, is this the same person? If we go into things like behavior, and it's just, I don't know the word you said, but the baloney, which I don't know that word, but I understand what it means. It's just, there's no fact in it. It's just probabilistic. Yeah, you take a lot of examples. It's like you say to a machine, or I say to you, I'll give you two sets of numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 1, 3, 5, 7. Is 36 in the first set or in the second set? You probably think, well, the first ones were the odd one or the even ones, and these are the odd, so 36 is going to be in the end. Maybe not. Maybe the sets I'm bringing in the first place are different as we go further. So if we have some examples, we can take conclusions, but they may be wrong. My set of numbers may not be 2, 4, 6, 8, and then it's going to be 11 and 13 for some other reasons. So the two sets that I propose, and the machines learn from this, I give them 2 sets or 3 or 10 sets, and I say, there's these 10 sets of people. There's a new person. Is this, in which set is it? The machine is just going to do something dumb, which we call artificial intelligence, to group them. And sometimes you can identify lots of good things with these dumb algorithms, like detecting if this person has cancer or not with 96% probability. That's useful. If you use it for things like, can I arrest this person based on this? Maybe you're doing the wrong thing. So machine learning is bound to fail. There's not 100%. Even if you're perfect, if you're doing the best, you're not going to be 100% sure. So you can do whatever you want with machine learning. Then what you do after the conclusions you take from it is what needs to be addressed, which is out of my technological background. It becomes to legal and politics and other things. So this was the first point. The second point is about the research and the project you mentioned. So we also do funded research projects, and from my perspective, there's a lot of checks that are done on the way your project is structured from the commission, their ethics, and it gives a lot of work to people trying to do this research, that there's all these things in place. My comment is, everyone that participates in them needs to give active consent, and the goal of the project actually can be to prove that all this research makes no sense and it's not usable. So in the sense that we are trying to prove something with machine learning, maybe we get to the conclusion that it's not enough to conclude this or that, and then we are actually doing research to help your point there, for example, that you cannot conclude stuff from, but you need to do research. If you just say, because of ethics, I don't want to do any research on this because we cannot do it, then you're losing, I think. If everyone is actively participating and you can conclude something from it, even if it is machine learning is not good enough for that purpose or that purpose, it's useful for everyone. There was a third point. What was the your question. So you had this question of, imagine this flow in the airport. Now it can be misused because there's this database of lots of things that I can track. The way we're trying to do this, and that's the big chunk of work and challenge we have, is how can we do it in a way that does not happen? So what is the path we're taking? We don't want any database of people and collecting of data attached to that biometrics anywhere in a central place. We want each of the persons, each person using the service to be in full control. At the moment when you use your passport, you voluntarily put it there, it reads, it checks, and it doesn't do anything else. Of course, in the border it does check that you're in on a watch list and all kinds of things, and that may be subject to this discussion again. But the fact that you put the passport there and you're recognized stays there. The only thing that goes out is passport number 13456 is here. What should I do with it? And then it's another thing. But for the biometrics itself, there's no biometrics elsewhere, in theory. Okay? Of course, for passports, I'm sure every country has the database of the passports stored somewhere, and that can be an issue. But for the whole airport thing that I was describing, border control is a bit different because of the seriousness in terms of the law. But for the rest, it's really about facilitation. And then it's about ensuring that everyone, when they go through that, doesn't leave that place. It's checked, your door's open for you to go, and it goes nowhere else. By design, there's no way for that biometrics to be elsewhere being used afterwards. And that's the path we're trying to go.
I think, thank you very much, Pedro, because you answered already to my question about how this this iBorder project within the Horizon 2020 program, how does it work, that it's really a prototype demonstration with no preview. It's an open-end research. It can be that it will be good, it can be that it will be bad. In any event, any kind of projects which are financed by the EU or co-financed by the EU funds must meet and the ethical principles and applicable law. And there, I think our services are very strict about it. Now, coming back to, oh, the Commission is just reflection and so on. It's a very serious, really reflection about the possibilities and benefits in a very broad sense of the words. It means that benefits of artificial intelligence, bearing in mind developing of technologies which are sustainable and which are in full respect and consciously deal with all the social, economical aspects of the deployment of artificial intelligence. So it's the reason the high-level expert group has 52 members from science, industry, and a legal world. It's a very broadly established group which is very vividly discussing a lot of different issues, and these guidelines on ethics which were published in December and which are being will be revamped and rewritten after we will have the results of the consultation, and hopefully which will be able to the group will be able to finalize in March, are supposed to mirror precisely that, to show how important it is, so that we can truly have the benefits of artificial intelligence. How do we need which elements, and how do we need to take into account what do we need to factor in, so that we have a sustainable development of artificial intelligence. And here it's audibility of this of artificial intelligence, checking whether the legislation we have so far, and here I fall back on the GDPR with automated decision-making, prohibition subject to exceptions, with transparency obligation, with the obligation to inform the data subject, the citizens who is subject to decision-making process, to be able to be explained what is the logic involved in the decision-making process, and what are the consequences for this individual. So I think there are a lot of elements in there, always trying to maintain this technological neutrality of the legislation, so that we do not foreclose for the developments which will be positive, but which induce responsibility and ethics considerations ab initio. GDPR is more about privacy and personal and protection of personal data, but of course we are all very much aware what, in particular, the facial recognition, what kind of danger it can mean from the point of view of non-discrimination. So I think we are very conscious and we take it very much into account.
Okay, thanks for that. Typically, I had a few more questions left, and we're not going to have time for that. So what I propose to do is I do want to finish with one question to the panel, but before I get them to answer, we'll then open it up to take some questions from the audience, and I would request that they are questions that finish with a question mark, and then I'll come back to each of the panelists to finish up. And, you know, if we had more time, I guess what I would be asking, you know, I would be talking about discrimination. It seems there's not a week that goes by when some article is published that shows that these systems have inbuilt bias, you know, that results in stereotyping or discrimination based on gender, ethnicity, whatever else. I would raise a point about accuracy. You know, for as long as these systems have been under development, civil libertarians have said, oh, it'll never work, and, you know, here we are 10 and 15 years later, and these things, you know, have reached the point where, and I sort of worry that it's just a challenge to computer scientists to, you know, give us more data, we'll make it work better one day. And then finally, you know, I think the question for everyone in this room is what should be done, and I don't know if any of you, or I expect most of you probably did see Brad Smith of Microsoft came out quite recently and said, you know, I'm just going to quote with what he said and then I'll hand it over to you guys. For the first time, the world is on the threshold of technology that would give a government the ability to follow anyone, anywhere, and everyone, everywhere. It could know exactly where you are going, where you have been, and where you were yesterday as well. And this has profound potential ramifications for even just the fundamental civil liberties on which democratic societies rely. Before we wake up and find that the year 2024 looks like the book 1984, let's figure out what kind of a world we want to create and what are the safeguards and limitations that we need. So my final question to the panel would be, what do we do? Regulation, ethics, codes of conduct, you know, nothing, sit back and watch it all unfold. So yeah, let's take some questions, then I'll come back to each of the panelists.
Yeah, Tobias Morsches from Datenschutzraum. Oh.
No, I was just saying, if you want to line up. For the, yeah. Please.
Tobias Morsches from Datenschutzraum Germany. My question is, we see a lot of political happenings in the world where opponents, opposition and so on is threatened in some way, the press is threatened. How do we prevent, without any deployment time, a new government to switch to just attacking an opposition or someone that is not wanted anymore, with just switching the system when it is already deployed?
Shall I go ahead?
Please.
Collect him. Charles Rabb, University of Edinburgh. This is a question for Sandra and also, I think, perhaps for Megan. It's a UK-based question because in the UK, and Ben has just said, what do we do about these things, ethics, regulation, or what have you? We've been down this track before with DNA, and we had the National DNA Database Advisory Group, which I don't think had much traction. We now have the Biometric and Forensics Ethics Group, which succeeded it in a different sort of way. And I just wondered whether you can give an estimation of how much effect or traction the BFEG is likely to have in terms of UK regulation or the establishment of ethical rules and principles for facial recognition.
Thanks, Charles. Just, yeah, we'll take these three questions, but I want to give the panel a chance to respond, so if you could be as quick as you can.
I'll be brief. My name is Emerald Deleu. I'm CEO of Eurocomply and faculty member at the Law Society of Ireland. Now, I have a question, and it's kind of a little bit related. Naturally, GDPR, great piece of robust legislation. However, I think on a global level, what we've seen is that this processing in the public interest or for public security and to keep the people safe is just increasing in scope. And what we end up with then is, if you're not happy, you file a complaint and you end up in front of the European Court of Justice or the European Court of Human Rights, but that takes forever. So do you have any thoughts on how we might overcome that? Because that is hugely problematic, because a lot can happen in those years in which this is actually being litigated.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Robin from Eindhoven University of Technology, and I have a question specifically to Sandra about the use of facial recognition in education. Well, as the moderator said, like, what would we do in the future? Don't you think this is more a reaction of demands from parents who want to know more about their children? And shouldn't the parents just step up for a high school or choose a different school? I don't think schools voluntarily spend a lot of money on monitoring systems without a demand for parents who are the people actually making the choices.
Great, thank you.
Hello, my question is for Pedro Torres. I have a twin sister, I have an identical twin sister, and my question is, if we are in the passport control, is there any chance I can use her passport and pass?
Thank you. And so there's more questions than any of you can possibly answer, but if you could go, I'll start at this end this time, and maybe like 90 seconds each to pick up on whatever point you would like.
Maybe the very precise question about the photographies and the definition of biometric data. So GDPR says very clearly that biometric data, which is processed for the purpose of uniquely identifying a natural person, and the facial recognition techniques deployed for it, falls under sensitive data, even, so it's personal data, it falls under sensitive data, it falls under the prohibitions of processing of sensitive data, if not one of the conditions of, under the regulations are fulfilled, which are very strict. Even consent has a higher level of the explicit consent. So this would be my very short answer.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to hurry you because we don't have much time.
And just maybe on the Irish question, from the Irish colleague, I mean, here, enforcers are the national DPAs. The regulation provides that the member states have the obligation to equip the national DPAs with sufficient resources, human and financial resources. Well, the Commission, our Commissioner, sent several letters recalling it and remembering the member states that they have the obligation to do it. Should we see that it's not the case, we have always the means of enforcing. The European Commission, as the guardian of the treaty, will not, will take use of the tools the treaty gives us. And the regulation also provides for the possibility of going also directly to the court. So it's no obligation of going first to the Data Protection Authority and then the court.
That's great, thank you. Pedro.
Okay, so
90 seconds.
90 seconds. I'll do it 45 plus 45. So there's two questions I want to address. One of them was from Leuven University. Alice was talking. So about if GDPR is enough for us to understand what we can do or not. I come from the technology side. So I don't know anything about law. But of course there are specific people in the company that deal with that. If you want to know if this is, can I do this or not, you ask a lawyer and they will tell you if you can or not. But if you ask 2 lawyers, then you may get 2 answers. And if you ask 10 lawyers, it's very complicated. There was a very simple example of how can I'm in a wedding and they were taking pictures. And in the end, there's thousands of pictures. I just want to get my pictures. And they had this algorithm. They will build, not with my company, but they was using facial recognition to separate pictures. This is of this person, of this person. Is this legal or not? And this can lead to a whole discussion between lawyers deciding if this or not. The second one about the twin. I get that question a lot, as you can imagine. The thing with biometric, if you're talking about facial recognition, the question I ask to you is, if you go to the border with your passport, you know you can go through the border pretending to be your sister. Currently, you can do that. So there's nothing different in a biometric system, if it's facial, that can tell. If you're just like your sister, you can be pretending to be her anywhere. Here, maybe you are your sister. I don't know.
Thank you.
So that's.
Hey.
I guess I would just close by saying, there's an enormous number of cameras out there. They're increasing every day. Cameras are very cheap. And what is expensive is human attention and human monitoring. And that is something that as AI gets smarter and smarter, is going to be able to become commodified, the monitoring part. And face recognition is the most crucial part of that, not the only part. There are many ways in which this monitoring will increase. And what should be done? I would love to listen with great interest to the discussions about to what extent GDPR already addresses the issues, and I would love to have, we need an overarching privacy law in the United States context, and we have also called for a moratorium on the use of face recognition by police departments until we sort out all of these issues around discrimination, effectiveness, et cetera. So we need general privacy regulation in the United States. We also need specific regulation on this, such as the Illinois law that we've seen so far. We need to put a halt to this very, very, potentially radical technology that has the potential to rewire our social and governmental relations in a way that we've never seen before in human history.
Brilliant. So 90 seconds, Sandy.
Let's tax surveillance. It's far too cheap, so people could just do what they like. Companies push it really hard. To respond to the 2 points that people made, yes, we have DNA covered under the Protection of Freedoms Act. The bodies are fairly feeble, aren't they? There's been such a proliferation of this stuff. Consent is always a very dubious issue on the horizon, so it's not working very well. So I do think we need more regulation. In response to the question of schools, well, I could talk all night, but should parents choose different schools? They can't, because schools just do this. Is it just a market, you know, a school choice market? I've written endless publications on the problems with school choice markets, so you don't have a free choice, so I can only assume that the questioner hasn't been in the position of having to choose schools for his own children. Commerce push these things incredibly hard, and schools are taken in. It's almost a con man operation sometimes. The claims that are made and the outcomes just don't marry up at all. So it's all very dodgy. The disruption of moving your child from a school that just suddenly decides to have these sorts of measures brought in is just enormous. And finally, a lot of the systems use junk data. They're based on junk policy and junk philosophy. And so she's just banned them all. Germany's got the right idea. Just take it all out of schools. I do not want to be in my nursing home being biometrically regulated as I shuffle down the lunch queue for my tray, because the younger generation's been softened up by having to do this themselves. We must turn kids into activists. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Meg, go.
How do you follow that? I was going to answer the GDPR question, but because of time, I won't. So if that person wants to speak afterwards, I'm more than happy to do that. I'll just address maybe Ben's more overarching question about where do we go from here, and is regulation enough? And speaking again just in the police context and the UK, Liberty would say, I would say, that even with regulation, the police shouldn't be able to use this technology. It is challenging. People will say to you, okay, imagine a scenario where there is a terrorist and you only have one picture of that person, and yes, you're taking the biometric data of everybody else in the crowd, but you immediately delete it. Isn't that okay? And you have to think hard about it, but I would still say that's not okay. And the reason why I say that is because, and people might not agree in this room, but it's not about the duration of the interference, but the nature of the interference. So even if you don't retain my data, it's immediately deleted because of safeguards in place. You have taken it just by the fact that I'm walking down my street. And final, very brief point is that we have to be aware that governments, as particularly the case in the UK, introduce this kind of technology on the sly, in secret, so that we all just get used to it. And what happens then is the conversation shifts to one about regulation, and we stop having the principled debate about whether we want to live in a society at all where this exists. And if I can make a plea to you is, please keep having that debate and be brave and take the principled point of view.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy your coffee.